Please go ahead, Professor Urama. You are on live.
Okay. So you're hearing me now? Okay, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon or good night, whichever part of the world you are joining the conference from. I bring you greetings from Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, the president of the African Development Bank Group, who is not able to deliver this opening speech in person due to other pressing engagements. On his behalf, I would like to thank the Institute and LSE for inviting the bank to deliver this opening speech at this inaugural China-Africa Conference. The theme of the conference and the topic you have requested me to speak on, which is leading the 22nd century, Africa's future and China's role in it, is indeed very exciting. As noted by in the event website, China has really become Africa's largest investor, biggest trading partner, preeminent digital service provider, and increasingly a soft power influencer. It is therefore very clear that China's role in Africa and Africa's future will be both complex and also enduring. And I would also like to add that Africa's role in the global effort to achieve inclusive and sustainable development is more crucial now than ever before. So this conference could not have come at a better time, especially as the recent pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, has impacted global economies, including Africa's and China's economies, in several ways. And while the impacts of this pandemic on global health systems, on global economies and societies, and are all very significant, it has also triggered fundamental discussions and rethinking on the current global systems of development cooperation. The pandemic has sufficiently, you would agree with me, demonstrated the long-standing inequities in the global development paradigms and the political economy of development cooperation in very fundamental ways. It is from this perspective that I'm going to discuss briefly what I see as the role of Africa in the 22nd century and the role of China in it. Let me just provide a bird's eye view on Africa's economy before and present, then the future, the Chinese economy before, present, then the future, and then how the two may work together in the 22nd century to lead inclusive growth and sustainable development, which I'm very passionate about. Africa is a continent with 54 countries, very different countries, and 1.3 billion people. This constitutes about 16% of the total world population. It is projected that in the next 30 years, more than half of the world's population increase will be in Africa. And by 2100, 80% of the world's population will be in Africa and Asia. The continent is also very richly endowed in both human capital and natural capital, with a very youthful population that provides teeming population of youths that can feed the labor market of the future, including in the 22nd century. Specifically, about 60% of Africa's population are youth below the age of 25. 41% are below the age of 15 years, compared to 28% in Central America and 24% in Asia and South America. You will agree with me that the role of Africa in the labor market of the future can therefore not be gainsaid. With regard to natural resources that feeds development in all industrial revolutions, Africa is also at the forefront. According to the US Geological Survey published in 2020, Africa hosts 30% of the world's mineral resources and accounts for more than 20% of global annual production of 5 key minerals. Name it: platinum 80%, cobalt 77%, manganese 51%, 46% of diamonds, 39% of chromium, and 22% of gold. With this rich endowment in natural capital and also human capital, and as well as other forms of capital that feed economic growth and development, Africa will remain the treasure trove of the world for years to come, including in the 22nd century. In addition, as we have seen in this current century, Africa offers high rates of return on investments. In many ways, one could therefore say that Africa is the next growth pole of the world come the 22nd century. But if we look at how Africa has fared, given all these resources, we would see that Africa needs to do more in order to harness these resources to go further. But Africa's economies have been very resilient, though different and heterogeneous, depending on regions and countries and the stages of development in which they are. On average, we have seen about 4.6% growth rates between 2000 and 2016. That was after the last 2 decades, where growth between 1980s and 90s, where the growth rates were hovering around 2%. Now, even after the pandemic, we're seeing that Africa's economies are rebounding. Despite 2.1% contraction in 2020 due to the effects of the pandemic, we are predicting that Africa's economy will rebound to 3.4% growth rates in 2021 and also 4.6% in 2022, respectively. So you would agree with me that given this resilience, Africa's economy presents huge opportunities for the world and for China, both in the current and in the 22nd century. But to harness these opportunities, a number of things still needs to be done. There is continued need for improvements in several economic fundamentals in Africa: managing inflation rates, fiscal deficits as percentage of GDP growth, total external debt as a percentage of GDP is also rising, and so are the associated debt service to revenue ratios. All these are trending the wrong direction. Africa also has not seen an inclusive growth, and this is something we could perhaps learn a little bit from China and other countries that have really achieved high rates of growth and spread that growth across populations through poverty alleviation programs. In terms of participation in the global economy, Africa is also not doing very well. Africa accounts for the least share in world trade, foreign direct investments, and share of global output compared to most other regions. Trade deficits are also widening, especially in its trade with China. On the other hand, intra-Africa trade still remains small, below 16% as at 2020. All these fundamentals need to be carefully looked into with clear policies to turn them around for Africa to lead the 22nd century and expand opportunities for China and the rest of Africa's partners in order to be able to achieve the sustainable development goals that we also care about. Now, let me look briefly at China and why it matters for Africa to deepen the relationship it already has with Africa and with China, and also for the rest of the world to do the same. In fact, you would agree with me that the pace, the depth, the scope, and ramifications of China's economic transformation since 1979 are indeed unique in economic history. It provides a number of lessons for Africa and other developing economies. From a very low base, China has grown its economy to become the second largest economy in the world, constituting about 17% of the world GDP at current market prices in 2020, coming second only after the United States. In fact, when we look at the purchasing power parity perspective, China is the #1 contributor to the world's GDP. And this is phenomenal, considering that only few decades past, China was in the place where Africa and most other developing countries are now, i.e. developing countries called third world countries. China has also lifted millions out of poverty through concerted and consistent structural policies that we can learn from as Africa to be able to lead the 22nd century. This begs the question, what can Africa do differently? And this is where I think this conference and my speech would like to focus on. What I would like to learn, we would like to learn from China and what China can learn from Africa and the rest of the world, so that together we can build a more sustainable and prosperous world, more resilient economies that can absorb similar shocks that keeps coming as headwinds that beset economies, like what we've just seen in COVID-19. Let me look at briefly the structure of China's economic policies that, in my view, made this happen. I'm not an expert in China's economic policies, but I'm just, as a layperson, looking from afar what is going on and what could have made this possible. First, the economic development strategy in China, in my perspective, focused on export-led growth based on the country's comparative advantages in labor-intensive industries at the beginning, and progressively increased into manufactured products and machineries and high technology products as the economies grew. Second, close attention was paid to China's economic and evolving endowments in terms of the structure of its economy and its comparative advantages in all sectors. Again, to harness this, they carefully designed industrial policies, upgrading them as their economy grew from one stage to the other. So if I look at this, I just have a very simple recommendation that I see coming out of how Africa can lead the 22nd century and learning from China and the role of China in it. One, China is an example that it is possible to transform economies within a generation. If China can do it, Africa can do it. For Africa to lead the 22nd century, therefore, the simple policy stance of having an organically evolving development policies and strategies owned by the people, designed by the people, and gradually upscaled as the development progress happens, will still apply to Africa. These seem to be the same policies that many other economies that have gone from agrarian low-income economies to high-income economies, including South Korea and Singapore and others, did. Africa's will not be different. What do we then expect China what role do we expect China to play for Africa or in Africa as Africa grows to lead this 22nd century that we're talking about? First, a trade partner. As of 2018, China's economy was larger than the entire Eurozone, 2.5 times larger than Japan, 5 times larger than India's, and the list goes on. And because of this enlargement in its GDP growth and economic activities, China has become a global demand and import market for trading partners. Africa needs to scale up and have a share in it. This is particularly important for Africa because currently over 90% of China's exports to Africa are high-end manufactured and technology knowledge-driven goods products. Therefore, the returns to technology goes to China. On the other side, Africa's exports to China are primary products, low-end, low-priced primary products. So we need to see how to reverse this trade imbalance going forward to harness more the role of China as a big market that Africa can take opportunities for. And the ACFTA that Africa has launched can be an opportunity for us to do that. I can see my time is running out. So in the next 2 minutes, let me just summarize some of the other few key points. Second, China is a great financier for Africa, and we have seen that happen tremendously over the decade, and this should continue in the 22nd century. Finally, for lack of time, I cannot list all the things that I've thought about in this regard. But let's focus on those two: targeted policies, trade partnerships, and finance. If we can harness this more and more, Africa will benefit more and more from the historic relationships that has existed between Africa and China, especially also including technology transfer and knowledge sharing. There is no binary choice here. Even though Africa is trading more and more with China, it has not reduced its appetite for trading with other regions. So it's not choosing China, United States, or the Euro area. Africa needs all its partners to fill all the huge financing gaps, both in infrastructure and knowledge, technology development, capacity development, and all the other things you can name it, to position Africa to rule, to lead the 22nd century. And finally, it is in the interest of the global community to build inclusive and sustainable development in Africa, because without this, the global sustainable development goals will not be achieved. Apologies for running over by 1 minute. Thank you so much.
Which we will be discussing in greater depth throughout the day, but also in the years to come. And those are really, really important messages from the indigenous leadership on from the African continent. So now joining Professor Urama as we kick off Unlock Africa's Economic Potential, Innovation and Sustainability, we have two global leading thinkers on the horizon. One, if I may introduce Phillip. Phillip Thigo is the senior director of first of all, senior director for Africa for the Thunderbird School for Global Management. But also, Phillip is the senior advisor on data innovation and open government for the Office of the Deputy President of Kenya. And we are very fortunate also in today's conference going to welcome the Deputy Chief of Staff for the President of Kenya, Her Excellency Ruth Kadia as well. So we so much appreciate the support from Phillip and also from the Kenyan government. And also joining us is Mr. Blake Goud, CEO of RFI Foundation. Blake has been doing tremendous amount of work, particularly on sustainable finance, not only throughout the Islamic world, but also Blake is going to tell us his visions about global sustainability. And so today, let's kick off from a couple of points that we have heard from Professor Urama's speech there. We start to see that Africa is bypassing the 20th century global industrial growth model, including the model that China has adopted. And Africa is today moving straight into the digital economy era. So what are some of the fundamental factors that are supporting Africa's digital transformation in such a massive way today? Any gentleman,
Thank you so much. No problem. I think, yeah, and not to try to repeat. And thank you so much, Shirley and LSE, for inviting us into this discussion. I think as we see, and your questions are right, how is Africa doing this? I see a couple of things. First of all, I think Africa is a continent of a lot of problems. And for those who know that, then that builds a resilient culture of innovation. So our innovations are not vanity innovations. Our innovations are built around responding to problems. The second piece, I think, Professor has just mentioned in terms of our demography. Our median age is 19.1. We're the youngest continent and the youngest people in the world, and basically digital natives. There's a generation here that we know that is mobile only. The other third piece, of course, is simply the entrepreneurial spirit, I think, of Africans, to the extent that we know how to manage, because in most cases we have a population that has a burden of history, and that is tied to exclusion, and therefore over time we've been able to leapfrog, and we call ourselves leapfrog capital of the world. The fourth piece, I think, is leadership and governance, and we've seen over time, despite the recent 2 or 3 weeks of coups that we've been seeing, we kind of have had a very robust African governance architecture led by member states from the African Union, to the extent that systems of governance now are very strong. We have a very strong open government, open governance culture, and then Prof has alluded to this co-creational element of government, and therefore understanding that the business of governance or government is not left to government alone. It is actually for everybody to co-create government, for government to be resilient. So those for me are the larger brushstrokes of why we see Africa, and I dare say leading in the fourth industrial revolution, of course, leading from the front. Previously, we've been leading from behind on the other three, whether it's steam, electricity, or ICT. But I think in the fourth industrial revolution, we are seeing that Africa is actually leading. Thank you.
So we are actually ambitiously looking at leapfrogging in the fourth wave of global industrial revolution. That is indeed very ambitious. But Professor Urama, earlier in your speech, you mentioned that if China can leapfrog in the previous two waves, essentially, of the industrial revolution in one generation, or let's say even if in two generations, that Africa certainly can do it. Can Africa do it? How confident are you in delivering that leapfrogging effect in, say, for example, the next 4 years or so?
Yeah, thank you very much. As my colleague, co-panelists have already mentioned, when I look at Africa, the landscape, I'm filled with optimism. And that optimism is the fact that we have seen good governance, good macroeconomic policies that are being implemented, and a uniting Africa. And I use the word uniting Africa in the sense that Africa's, under the leadership of the African Union, Africa is coming together to create transformative policies. We have the ACFTA we have talked about, we have the Open Visa Index, that several policies in agriculture, in energy, and when you see what happened, even in COVID-19, you can see the level and scale to which Africa's governance has improved. That is key, because leadership is everything. And second, my optimism also stems from my work when I was working in Kenya in an African technology policy studies. We had launched an innovation challenge program, and I was blown over by the kinds of innovative and creativity that you see amongst Africa's youths and women. And given that this is about 60% of Africa's population, I can only be so optimistic that Africa can and is doing it. Not can do it, but is already doing it. We have the M-Pesa technology, we have the M-Pedigree technology, we have several technologies that is coming out of Africa and transforming the world. Now, the point that I'll make here is what Phillip has made. We were lost out in the first, second, and third industrial revolutions. And in the fourth industrial revolution, Africa is really shaping it, because the youths are the most innovative, and we have the largest population of youths. So we have what it takes in order to do that. And then also, as I want one of my publications on how social innovations is driving transformative change in Africa, in Stanford Innovation Review, it was very clear to me that we have all the rudiments that is required in national innovation systems in most countries in Africa: Kenya, Rwanda, Nigeria, South Africa. We have several hubs where innovation is now thriving and is being prioritized by leadership. So I really see an Africa that leads the future in terms of taking over, leading the fourth industrial revolution. So yes, Africa can, and Africa is already doing it.
So, well, Phillip, I see you smiling there. So obviously you agree with Professor Urama. However, I tend to think it's a fantastic idea to think about the idea of unifying Africa. We have the African Union, but also now we have the combination of the AFCFTA. Very, very exciting on the horizon. But on the other hand, Africa is composed of 55 countries on the continent. and they are not. They have different languages. They have each country has their own borders, and so there are different sets of rules, legal systems. And so I understand in the digital economy, say for example, 75% of the cost of e-commerce today is attributable to logistics cost. So Africa obviously is not integrated yet. There are a lot of risks that are still on the horizon for digital integration, isn't there?
Sure, I totally agree. And the interesting bit, and this is what I say, is that of course digital integration is happening in a fast-moving pace. Technology that was there yesterday is not there today, and we don't even know the technologies of tomorrow. So I think the case of Africa is this case of building as we fly. But we have the fundamentals. The fundamentals, as Prof has mentioned, is we have a functioning Africa Union. We have regional economic commission. So we have these policy platforms that if made agile enough, can quickly respond and trigger those mechanisms that improve integration. We have the largest free continental trade area. And as I say, we don't have all the answers, but we have the fundamentals. The second piece, as you mentioned, is now understanding that as we're going into the fourth industrial revolution, we need to start investing in the infrastructure of the fourth industrial revolution. And this is something that I think we've seen from the leadership of His Excellency, the President Kenyatta here, is not necessarily investing in technology, is investing in the infrastructures that create resilient technologies. One is data and data systems. The second one is internet infrastructure. We know we need broadband for that integration, of course, of digital economy. The third one is skilling and upskilling. And I know Prof has mentioned this. We have quite a high skilled population, but we need to be able to skill and upskill. The fourth, of course, is energy. How do you ensure that we have energy that is sustainable and resilient? As we know, Africa is only a third of Africa is connected. The fifth piece, and this is where we are getting it right, is agile governance and ensuring that policies that we put in place are not stifling innovation, but are ensuring that innovation thrives even beyond borders. And that is why I see these regional economic commissions and the African Union Commission, including our infrastructure like the Africa Development Bank, the UN Economic Commission for Africa, are creating that, I say, ecosystem that then creates a foundation for resilience going forward. And I think we're the only continent that does that at the moment. Over.
So, Blake, it's very interesting. Professor Urama, who happens to be a leading thinker on Africa's sustainability, I'm sure you two have a lot to chat about there. Professor Urama earlier mentioned that Africa is going to be a leader in achieving global SDG goals. We are 9 years away from achieving the UN designated SDG goals by 2030. And well, Africa has a lot of youth. Africa is a burgeoning economy, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. And all of these means that Africa wants to grow. But a lot of times when you invest in sustainable investments, you do sacrifice on the returns on investment, don't you? How do you balance the two objectives?
Well, the returns picture has evolved considerably over the last 5 years, where it's not clear that you do sacrifice returns. But I think the main important thing, picking up on what's been said already, is that there's tremendous potential building, and one of the big things that sustainability and sustainable finance needs to focus on is making sure that that doesn't get tipped off course by things like climate change, which by and large Africa has a very small role in creating, and so I think that's one of the aspects where the investment side has to be really focused, and developing financial system has to be really focused on making sure that there's the resilience in financial systems to support the continued development on the technology and fourth industrial revolution. And I think we've seen some big opportunities and challenges that have come out just in the last week with the announcement from President Xi at the UN Global Assembly about the cessation of international coal financing. And I just found there was a quote, sort of as some of the banks have followed the government's policy, from a Boston University Global Development Policy Center professor, Kevin Gallagher saying, if the pledge includes commercial banks, it's more ambitious than anything the West has done, and it's going to have a huge impact in Africa in terms of immediate investments that don't happen, and figuring out how to channel those into directions that support building the energy infrastructure, which was one of the points brought up just a minute ago as one of the key needs to make sure that the next 9 years go sort of according to plan and don't get derailed.
Right, this is really interesting. So a lot of the China's push towards carbon neutrality 2060 is actually creating a ripple effect, as we witness today across the developing world, and I'm sure that's going to be a sort of a positive for Africa's sustainability as well. But Professor Urama, you mentioned that Africa single-handedly holds over 30% of the world's natural resources. It's just so instinctively attractive to think, hey, we're going to mine the resources, and that's how that's the assets we have, and that's how economies can grow. How do you convince these government leaders?
Yeah, we lost Professor Shirley. But are you hearing me so I can respond to her question? Okay. Now, the points are really very clear in terms of, I always say, in Africa, the imperatives for going green and going inclusive and sustainable cannot be gainsaid. In the first instance, African economies currently, in all intents and purposes, is green, but not inclusive. So the sustainability angle for me is about triangulating three things. One, the economic development goals of countries, the sustainable development goals of the world, and also the social development goals of countries. And when we have the social capital, the natural capital, and the biophysical capital together, then we'll be able to have some form of equilibrium in nature that will allow us to continue to harness our natural resources for development going forward. The second imperative for me is that Africa is not really benefiting from what I call oxymoronic, harvesting or extraction of natural resources at the moment, because, like I've said, we import raw materials at very low-end prices, and from my analysis, our analysis in the African Development Bank Group, we've seen that the real prices just deflate by inflation. Yeah. The real prices of most of Africa's primary products in the global export market has been trending downwards since the 1960s, which means that you are losing money selling them raw. So what Africa needs to invest in more is in technologies and innovations. And this investment, that's why you see this focus on technologies and innovations in Africa. And that focus on technologies and innovations achieves one thing. In economic theory, we know that the rent in markets go to the technology owners. So the more Africa continues to invest in technologies and innovation, we will be able to operate at higher efficiency levels in the economy. And that higher technical efficiency also leads to higher market efficiency and economic efficiency. And our analysis in the International Resource Panel also shows that countries that has moved to these higher efficiency levels just automatically decouple economic development from environmental harm. We see that in the United States, we see that in Europe, we're now beginning to see that in China as well. So poverty in itself and operating at low levels of development is bad for the environment. And if you see in the energy sector, which I've studied quite a lot, if we only decoupled Africa's cooking systems from firewood, even if we used coal-fired power plants to provide electricity and give people, cooking hobs so that they don't go cutting down the trees and using firewood, we reduce CO2 emissions in Africa by almost 80%. So it is a win-win for Africa to go green, to try drive inclusive growth, and Africa actually seems to be the continent that has all the fundamentals to be able to do that, because again, we don't have the lock-in in infrastructure that many other countries already have in the what is called brown economy. But having said that, it is not a binary choice for Africa. In energy, in agriculture, in technology, the overarching goal would be to triangulate those three angles: economic growth to improve the welfare of people, social equity to ensure that there's inclusive development, and also managing our natural capital sustainably for longer. So Africans are known for the culture, what we call the Ubuntu culture. We don't rely on individualism. We rely a lot more on you and I. It's a we culture instead of the I culture. So I exist because you exist. Contrary to some other cultures where it's I think, therefore I exist. So for us, no matter how you think, you exist because of your neighbor. So we exist because of also of our children. So intergenerational equity is embedded in Africa's culture. So that idea of keeping the ecosystem safe was there in Africa even before we started talking about sustainable development goals. And Phillip knows that we have sacred forests, we have sacred goats, sacred cows, sacred all those things to protect the stock of that natural capital. And this was the wisdom of our forefathers. So for me, sustainability is natural to Africa's economic growth paradigms. And it's only for us to build organically and not copy the kinds of development paradigms that we have seen from the rest of the world. In agriculture, we have mixed cropping, natural to Africa, rather than monocropping, which creates all the environmental harms. So Africa should think home more and build organically instead of copy development paradigms from outside. That's good for sustainability of the world. Thank you.
Well, absolutely. Well, Professor Urama, you have you work at the African Development Bank, and so you would be the absolute authority to say that Africa needs lots and lots of investment in infrastructure, not only for digital but also for economic sustainability. But when it comes to investing, Blake, of course, you are a full supporter of sustainable investment and sustainable finance. But I would say when the continent is so in dire need of investment in infrastructure and on a massive scale, if there are investments coming into the continent, and the continent, the natural instinct would be to say that I want all the investments that are coming in, right? But are you saying that we should make a differentiation to ensure that sustainability starts at the beginning, at the early stage of development? And how do you ensure that?
Yeah, I think one thing that we talked a little bit about sort of the time frame that we're talking about here of the long term, and one of the things that really slows or limits the ability to focus on the long term and sustainability issues, and something that we've found from some research that we've done is that high levels of indebtedness by companies hinders the ability to have a margin of safety against sustainability-related ESG risk, environmental, social, and governance risks. And so, as much as the investment is needed in infrastructure, I think there's also has to be a focus also on how does that meet the needs only of the present at the expense of the future, which tends to make it unsustainable, whether you're talking about infrastructure in Africa or housing in the United States. And so what we found is that even in less sustainable sectors where there's investment going in to make it more sustainable, one of the key things that helps benefit investors and ultimately benefit everyone through making the investment successful is avoiding over leveraged situation. And what we've looked at this in the context of comparing Islamic screens and overlaying them on a sustainable investing approach, and it's really on the transitioning and the improving sustainability performance of particular sectors that this comes into play, where you can win a lot more by giving yourself that margin of safety and not going for every available opportunity, no matter how much debt gets piled on in the process. And I think that's going to be important for everyone in the world going forward, because the impact of climate change is going to be more and more intense as the years go by, and Africa has a lot of exposure to the physical risk impacts, and so it becomes even more important to just be cognizant of
Right.
that.
So very sure. Very interestingly, like you talked about debt sustainability, and I'm sure Professor Urama, you have heard as well as we do throughout global debates about Africa's debt sustainability, and a lot of there has been a lot of mentions about debt traps. And China single-handedly holds on to 20% of Africa's debt post COVID-19, and is indeed a large debt holder. So now for Africa, in terms of looking at future development, will Africa borrow even more from the current leverage? Is there a choice? Is there an alternative for Africa to borrow less?
Okay, these are very complicated questions that needs a very complicated answer in many ways. Before I go into that, let me just try and address the other question that that's already been addressed just previously, in terms of the fact about whether Africa should prioritize one investment against the other. This is a question I grappled with for many years now, in terms of how do we drive inclusive and sustainable development in Africa. Let me come back to what I call the golden triangle of sustainable development. We cannot achieve sustainability by keeping people poor, because poverty engenders environmental degradation. We see that in agriculture, we see that in households, we see that everywhere. So the first thing to do is to actually ensure that every environmental policy is not slowing down economic development, especially for countries that have not reached that inflection point where higher efficiency, technical, economic, and physical efficiency has been achieved. If you keep countries at that level, they will just continue to pollute the environment. That's not good for anyone. So, and at the same time, we should also not expect to have economies that are operating at a very high GDP growth rates and per capita GDP growth rates beyond what is necessary. So the whole idea about trying to give space for transitions for countries that are low income is necessary, and is actually embedded in the COP21 agreement and in all sustainable development discussions that I have been in globally. So the current approach of maybe trying to create a trade-off between investments, whether it's green, brown, or yellow, or whatever color we brand it, and development, I think is a wrong approach, because it creates environmentalism as a trade-off with economic growth. And once you do that, the poor will want to gain access to economic welfare today, because economic theory, because this is London School of Economics, economic theory tells me that the discount rate of the poor is very high. So they will prefer $1 today than $200 tomorrow, because they don't even know whether they will survive till tomorrow. So if we don't give them that opportunity to grow to that level where the economy is stable enough and able to sustain high level of technologies, high value added products, and so on, we will continue to exploit the environment oxymoronically. So let me just put that aside. And then on the point that you have, so for me, the whole issue is to find an equilibrium between the three: the social, the economic, and environmental goals. That's the only way we achieve sustainability. So that's one.
Absolutely.
Then the question you've asked me now in terms of
we have to balance the
what was the second question, please? I have forgotten it. What's the question you asked me now?
I was going to ask you, Philip. I was going to ask Philip your thoughts here. Okay. Professor Urama mentioned earlier that China has become a major supporter of Africa's digital infrastructure and digital transformation. And I believe Professor Urama used some words that are expressed as complex and enduring impacts that are brought by China. Give us some sense, Phillip, of the actual scale and the depth of China's digital engagements in Africa, please.
Oh, the scale is massive. If you think about especially the sort of the hardware piece of technology, I think it's one of the companies. I think Huawei is the one that is most dominant, and we're talking about from base stations to sort of fiber cables to switches. I mean, it's quite extensive, and we're seeing now China, including handsets, right? Has one of the most affordable handsets, and I think China investments around handsets has really brought down and created sort of affordability and accessibility to mobile phones. As I mentioned previously, we have generations that are mobile only. And I think this is simply because handsets have been quite affordable. And this has lowered the barrier of access to technology. The second piece, and what I'm seeing is around policy, and this is in the case of Kenya, where we are seeing China and Chinese companies are very much involved in how to ensure that our last mile technology is actually affordable and accessible to population, especially in rural areas, where in most cases other companies may not have found it profitable. So we are seeing that kind of collaboration and co-creation, which is what I think the future must hold. The third piece, I think, is this notion, and I know Professor Urama, you'd know this. I think the whole notion of we do not need to westernize or easternize. I think it's really about modernizing within our context. And this is why we've seen, for example, affordability even of Wi-Fi routers. I've seen public Wi-Fi access very much built on top of Chinese technology. As we talk about 5G now, again, I'm seeing China working closely with Africa to go into that next phase of connectivity. And I think finally around our sort of environmental goals, and this is somewhere where I'm seeing now to the extent of, and I call this a Joshua generation, basically between China and Africa, having learned from previous investments, but thinking through because of our connectivity, talent, networking, and even language. We've been seeing now CGTN. It's one of the largest Chinese news networks in Africa, even showcasing and featuring more these collaborations. So as Professor Urama says, it's complex, but I think how we harness these collaborations in a way that showcases the possibilities of this collaboration in a very equitable footing, then can be the only way we go into the future. Over.
Okay, I think we've lost Prof again. But then if you're hearing me, let me take the opportunity to address the question she asked about debt. Yeah, before she comes back on. You know, on the question of debt, I always talk about debt productivity, not the absolute debt to GDP ratio. Debt financing is a sure way of doing business everywhere, both for governments, public, private sector, and so on. But the question is not how much you borrow. The question is what you do with what you borrow. Because if you're borrowing for productive investments, and the productive investments has a good yield curve that will allow you to repay the loan and also make profit, that's a great business to do. And that's how every economy, in the private or public sector, grows. The problem in Africa and the developing world is what are the terms of the borrowing, what do you borrow for, what do you do with the borrowing, and what's the transparency and accountability associated with the borrowing on behalf of the public. In China, since 2015, China became the largest creditor for Africa, representing about 13% of Africa's debt, total Africa's debt. And by last year, debt service to China is estimated to, by this year, is estimated to be about 6.5 billion. Debt service. So the question here is, if we're paying those interests to service the debt, what have we done with the debt that we got? And that question is for Africa to answer, not for China to answer, because the creditor wants to lend. The borrower needs to borrow reasonably. So we need the issue about public financial management. And this is why the bank has developed and launched a debt action plan for Africa to start moving countries towards this issue of debt productivity and debt sustainability, rather than just borrowing for recurrent expenditures and more and more. And more generally, trying to create transparency and accountability in public financial management systems across the continent. Thank you.
Very interesting. So now, when it comes to investing in sustainability, it's inevitable that countries and regions have to develop a vibrant capital market. And I think one of the experiences Professor Urama has mentioned, quite a number of lessons that Africa could potentially borrow from the Chinese development experience. However, one thing, if I may add, is that China has developed a vibrant capital market over the past 4 decades. China's stock exchange is the second largest in aggregate in the world, right after the United States, and China's bond market is currently quite wide as well. So where do we stand with Africa's private capital market emergence at the moment?
Phillip, are you going first or should I go first?
I know, Phillip, in the private sector, you do need a lot of private capital financing, right? But as a old gentleman said, you have mentioned that Africa is actually, we would love to think that Africa is a unity. And ideally, that should be the way. However, currently, in terms of the digital rights, Africa is actually quite differentiated, isn't it? So there are different pockets within Africa that are really, really vibrant in terms of technology and digital startups. So give us an idea, who are rising in Africa?
Thank you so much. I think, and this comes back to, I think, how we started the conversation around the fundamentals in terms of countries that have good laws and legislations around private investments, are relatively independent press and media, investments around digital infrastructure, a good ease of doing business index. So it will be those raft of countries, and countries that kind of are relatively stable in terms of democratic values and principles. So of course, bias, Kenya, without blinking, Nigeria, of course, Rwanda, being punching above its weight, Mauritius, Cape Verde, that people don't really talk about, and that is really moving around this sense. Of course, Egypt in terms of space and space industry. When you come to Uganda, in terms of artificial intelligence. So when you look at these countries, and this is what I love about the continent, countries are finding niche areas around digital and technology. Ethiopia, we've seen now Ethiopia opening up. They've just opened up Safaricom. We know they're opening up another license in terms of telcos. When you come down to Tanzania, which people are not seeing, Tanzania is also coming very strongly around technology, especially around education and edtech. So we could work around that interesting map in terms of how countries are beginning to see how potentially their ecosystems can take advantage of their competence and capacity so that they can compete. So it's, as you're right, it's not the same all over the place, but then it's interesting that countries are finding niches. Finally, women, and I know this is a topic we've not mentioned. As much as we're seeing countries, there's a demography that is again pushing very strongly around because of STEM, of course, science, technology, engineering, and math. And surprise, surprise, Sub-Saharan Africa is the only part of the world where there are more women entrepreneurs than men. And now we are seeing them more harnessing technologies in terms of their small and medium enterprises. So this for me will be the trends to watch.
Very interesting. Well, we are coming to the end of our session, but I do want to bring in a question from our social media audience. It's basically asking quite a challenging question. I don't know if any of us would love to take on with that one. How will political stability be guaranteed in Africa, particularly with the recent events that are taking place?
Okay, maybe I will take a stab on that one. The issue of political stability is a process. And I think one of the challenges we have in Africa is that we want to leapfrog in everything. It takes years to build democracies, and Africa's democracies from all intents and purposes, are still very young. So when you have an incident generalizing to try to talk about political stability in Africa, for me, is an overshot in how people react to things. And if you look at Africa and successful elections, democratic transitions, we have several examples everywhere on the continent, and there is no region in the world where political stability is guaranteed. And I think we can look at recent, even countries where democracy came to from us. Democracy is always challenged, and that is why it is democracy. And it is the ability of the institutions to sustain and bounce back that matters more than the challenges that happen. And that's what you see. That's what I love about America and many other countries in Europe, where we have seen blips in democracy, but then you find that the institutions bounce back and have a correction and continue to move forward. So for me, Africa's democracy has improved significantly. Without that, we wouldn't have seen all this good progress that we have seen in the past 2 decades. And then you asked a question which we jumped, which was the issue about the capital markets in Africa. The same way that you see in technology revolutions, you see different capital markets in Africa strengthening. But for me, we need to grow deeper and create pan-African markets that will be able to deal with the currency questions in order to fast track the leapfrogging in capital market development on the continent. But that could be another topic for another day.
That is so enormously interesting. Well, if I may just add a quick commercial for, not that Mr. Jing Donghua needs any at all, we are going to welcome Mr. Jing Donghua, Vice President and Treasurer of the World Bank, for our special luncheon dialogue. But before that, Jing Dong has very graciously done a fireside chat with us ahead of time, and in which he did talk about the excitement in the Pan-African continent, and he's very hopeful. He said the reason that Africa has started later with its development process was because of a lot of the regional unfortunate wars and conflicts and etc. And up till the 1990s, Africa, given the past 2+ decades of development, Africa has done an extraordinary job. And so for any of our social media audience who have some time to watch Jing Dong's fireside chat with the LSE, I highly encourage you to do so. It's absolutely fantastic insights in there. And so is our panelists today in today's session. We certainly have shown the great ambition from the African continent. And so with that, allow me to wrap up and thank our amazing speakers, Professor Urama from the African Development Institute of the African Development Bank, and he's coming on behalf of President Adesina of African Development Bank. Phillip Thigo, Senior Advisor to the Deputy President of Kenya on digital and data technology. Blake Goud, CEO of RIF Foundation and a leading global thinker on sustainable finance. I thank you so much for your time, and please join us for the next session coming up, One African Market under AFC.